Okay, so here we go. We're now starting chapter 27. So we are starting with protist. Okay, so here are the objectives. We're going to summarize the ecological and medical importance of protists. We're going to evaluate the evolutionary relationships among protists, and we're going to describe life history innovations that evolved in protists. Okay, and then we're going to end it with some uh, by describing some key features of some of the major lineages of protists. All right, so we're now moving on to the third domain. So now we are on domain Eukarya, the third domain of life. And so these organisms, they range from single-celled organisms that are about the size of bacteria to large organisms like redwood trees and blue whales. So eukaryotes are diverse, but they also share a lot of fundamental features that distinguish them from bacteria and archaea. So, for instance, eukaryotes are usually larger organisms. They have a lot of organelles. Okay, they have um, an extensive cytoskeleton, and also in several lineages of eukaryotes, multicellularity has evolved. Okay. And let's see, they also lack a nuclear envelope. And then finally, eukaryotes can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Okay, so that is different from bacteria because bacteria and archaea only reproduce asexually. Okay? So protists include all eukaryotes, with the exception of land plants, fungi, and animals. So, so this is an informal group. Okay, they have no defining features, and because they have no defining features, um, they do not form a naturally occurring unified group. Protists, one thing that you will notice is that they tend to live in environments where they're surrounded by water most of the time. So if you think of like the different algae that you've looked at in lab or other protists, like some of the protozoans that we looked at in the first protist lab, like amoeba or plasmodium, sorry, not plasmodium, paramecium. That's what I want to say. Okay, so those live in aquatic environments as well. Okay, so here's a look at a phylogenetic tree that shows eukarya. Okay, so as you can see, even if you do have a common ancestor here at this node for eukaryotes, this for protists, that is, you do have a common ancestor for all protists, but they don't include all of the descendants. So that makes this group, so the protist group, a paraphyletic group because there's no feature that distinguishes them from other. There's no feature that protists have that other groups do not have. Okay, so protists includes all of these groups except fungi, animals, and land plants. Okay, and here's some examples um, of why protists are considered to be abundant in marine environments. Okay, so some of the examples are like the diatoms that are found on the surface of water uh, habitats. You have the gigantic protists like the giant kelp. Okay. And then you have protists like the brown algae that you can find in intertidal zones. So biologists study protists for three reasons. Okay? Because of their importance medically, their importance ecologically, and also to understand the evolution of plants, fungi, and animals. So some of the impacts that they can have on on humans. So there are several types of protists that can cause diseases in humans. Okay. So for instance, like the Irish potato famine of 1845, this was caused by a type of water mold. So it's a protist. It's called a Phytophthora infestans. Okay. So this was a disease that caused a lot of crops to fail, and so it led to a lot of diseases, and starvation, deaths. Okay, so it did a lot of damage. Some of the other problems that protists can cause humans is things like malaria. So malaria, it's one of the worst chronic infectious diseases, and it's caused by several species of Plasmodium. So so the disease is transferred from humans to mosquitoes. Okay. There are several stages of Plasmodium when you're looking at the life cycle of the protist. So they go through several life cycle stages. Um, look when they If you look at where they start in the mosquito all the way through to humans and then back into the mosquito. So here's a diagram of the life cycle of Plasmodium. So if we start here where the mosquito bites the human, so when the mosquito bites the human, in the saliva of the mosquito are the cell types of Plasmodium. So these cells then travel into the liver where they embed themselves in the liver cells. And when they're there, they're reproducing asexually. So each of those cell types of Plasmodium is reproducing asexually through mitosis. Eventually, they'll burst out of the liver cell and find their way into the bloodstream. And once they're in the bloodstream, that's where they infect red blood cells. So each of those cell types will infect a red blood cell. They'll continue to reproduce asexually through mitosis, and eventually, what develops are these gametes. So the gametes will burst out of the red blood cells, and they'll be in the bloodstream. And then when another mosquito comes along and bites the human again, then the new mosquito will take in those gametes into the body. And then inside the mosquito is where fertilization occurs. So the gametes combine to form a zygote through fertilization, and you get the zygote. And so then the zygote develops through meiosis and back into those cell structures that will eventually travel to the salivary glands of the mosquito. Okay? And then the cycle begins again. So here's some other examples of problems that are caused by protists. So I already mentioned Plasmodium that can cause malaria. In lab, I also mentioned things like Chagas disease that's caused by trypanosoma. Okay, so that's a disease uh, that occurs primarily in Latin America. And then you also have another disease caused by trypanosoma, well, different species of trypanosoma. It's called the sleeping sickness. So the African sleeping sickness. Yeah. Another harmful thing that they can cause are algal blooms. So a bloom is when a unicellular species population grows very rapidly and increases in density. in these aquatic environments. Okay, and they're caused by photosynthetic dinoflagellates. So these dinoflagellates produce toxins that are harmful to humans. Okay. So you have a lot of dinoflagellates that are growing in population and in density. And then what happens is you have these shellfish like clams or other bivalves that eat them, right? Because clams they feed by suspension feeding or filter feeding. So they'll take in these dinoflagellates. The dinoflagellates will build up in the clams or other shellfish. They won't hurt the shellfish, but when the human eats them, then it'll poison them. Okay, so here's what an algal bloom would look like, caused by these dinoflagellates. So protists play a key role in aquatic food chains. Okay. So plankton are diatoms and other small organisms that drift in the open oceans or lakes. But a specific type of plankton, which are called phytoplankton. So these are plankton that can uh, that can use uh, photosynthesis to take in carbon from the atmosphere and then fix it to form sugars. So these act like primary producers. Okay, so there are species that produce energy by photosynthesis. And so the production by marine protists represents about half of the total carbon dioxide that's fixed on Earth. So they do take in a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Okay, and just as a review, a food chain describes nutritional relationships among organisms. So many of these phytoplankton species of protists are at the base of food chains in aquatic environments. So when you remove them, that causes a lot of it affects a lot of other animals because you have these primary producers, these phytoplankton. They're fed on by primary consumers. Okay, so other types of protists, and then those are usually fed on by small fish or shrimp, and those feed larger fish, and eventually those feed humans or whales and animals like that. Okay, so they also help limit, or protists could also help limit the global climate change because they play a key role in the global carbon cycle. So the global carbon cycle is the movement of carbon atoms from CO2 molecules in the atmosphere to organisms on land or ocean and then back into the atmosphere. So what researchers are trying to do is reduce the global climate change by decreasing CO2 emissions and increasing the amount of carbon that's stored in aquatic and terrestrial environments. Okay. So when you have a lot of forests, those serve as storage for a lot of carbon in terrestrial environments. In aquatic environments, you can have protists that play a key role in those carbon sinks. Okay. So the carbon sinks are long-lived carbon repositories because when you have these uh, things like phytoplankton or other protists that feed on them. So usually the protists that feed on them have these shells that are made out of calcium carbonate. And so when these animals die, those shells and parts of the animals fall to the ocean, to the bottom of the ocean, where with the pressure of the water and other sediment that falls on top of them, eventually they form rock. So like limestone. Okay. Another way that they um, play a key role in the carbon cycle is because of the way they form petroleum. So petroleum is the accumulation of dead bacteria, archaea, and protists at the bottom of the ocean. Oh, here's a diagram of those carbon sinks forming. Okay, so you have the CO2 in the atmosphere. That's used by the primary producers like phytoplankton, because they're the ones that are using photosynthesis, okay, to make sugars. Those are fed on by those primary consumers that have those calcium carbonate shells. And then when those die, along with the decomposers and other scavengers, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. And then eventually this layer turns into sedimentary rock. Okay. And it just stays there for a long time. So could protists help limit global climate change? Well, recent research shows that fertilizing the ocean with iron may speed up the carbon cycle. So because iron plays a key role in um, the protist's ability to use photosynthesis, if you fertilize the ocean with iron, you could speed up um, the population growth of protists because they have more, they're able to photosynthesize more, and so they're able to produce more sugars. They're able to grow in size and in populations, and so the protist populations will increase, and that means that the movement of carbon into carbon sinks increases. Okay, because that means that more carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere, used by the protists. The protists are reproducing, they're living, and then when they die, they're falling to the bottom of the ocean. And so all that carbon is going from the atmosphere to the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so that's one thing that scientists are looking at to help limit global climate change. All right, so we'll pause here, then we'll continue with the next section.